Let's be seated, please. Program Director, Minister Naledi Pandor, the Bizos family, ministers and deputy ministers, the acting Premier of Gauteng, Ms. Faith Mazibuko, the Mayor of the City of Johannesburg, Mr. Jeff Makubu, the Treasurer General of the African National Congress, Mr. Paul Mashatile, retired Deputy Chief Justice, Justice Tikhang Museneke, the Eminence, the Bishop Damaskinos, leaders of a number of non-governmental organizations that are here that George Bizos worked with so closely, the Legal Resources Center, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and many others. Members of the legal fraternity who worked with George, ambassadors, fellow mourners. There are very few in our society of whom it can be said that they inspired an entire generation to follow in their footsteps. It is not many who are of such distinguished reputation that they are known simply by their first name, not just in their own social circle, but in this entire country. It is only the rarest of individuals upon whom the title Champion of the Oppressed is bestowed. George Bizos was such a man. As we say in our languages, a great tree has fallen. A tree that gave shade to the patriots that founded our great nation and sheltered the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable. We're here to celebrate and also to bid farewell to a titan of the legal profession whose defense of the cause of justice was as tenacious as it was lifelong. George Bizos arrived in South Africa in 1941, having escaped the flames of war in his native Greece. He was just 13 years old and was a refugee. His was a deeply personal experience of being forced from one's home and of being treated like a second-class citizen in the land of one's birth. He knew the pain of exile and of being stateless and rootless. There can be no doubt that his personal background influenced and nourished the great well of empathy, of compassion, of passion as well, and solidarity that drove George in the practice of his craft, the law. He was, in his own words, a lover of freedom. The love of freedom would put him on an inevitable collision course with the apartheid state. He was destined to be an activist lawyer and a champion of the liberation struggle. We read in his memoirs how it astounded him that he, a refugee from Europe, had more rights in South Africa than the black majority. born and bred in South Africa. He could not and would not accept how he, a white immigrant, could be well-fed, clothed, educated, while the native people of the country lived in squalor and deprivation. This George would not accept. His activism really began when he was a student at the University of the Witwatersrand in the late 40s. It was at university that, as we have heard, he first met Nelson Mandela, and he would later go on to defend him and others in both the 1956 treason trial and the 1963 Rivonia trial. This was the start of a lifelong friendship, which he describes so well in his book, 65 Years of Friendship. President Mandela would later write that George was like a brother to him, and that he was greatly comforted that during his long imprisonment, his family was being looked after by his friend. At Wits, he joined the Student Representative Council and soon became involved in the struggles of black students on the campus. The apartheid government punished him quite severely by denying him citizenship for over 3 decades. And there he was, living stateless in a country that he had adopted. George's biography relates that the refusal letter told him he was not fit and proper to become a South African citizen. But the rebel rouser that George Bizos was, he would not go quietly. He never laid claim to having been a firebrand or a revolutionary. He sought neither honors nor recognition, and he was not given to talking about himself. He did not desire fame, nor did he seek it. Even when apartheid ended, he never brandished his past to cover himself in glory and to loudly proclaim to the world where he was, what he did during the fight for liberation. George Bizos never did that. He never did that because he was there. He was always there. At every crucial point in our country's history and along our path to liberation, George was there. Quietly, but also loudly. Unassumingly, but also forcefully. The courtroom was his front line, and the law was his key weapon. That he was not affiliated to a political movement does not mean he was apolitical. He understood that to love freedom means to forever be political, and that defense of the rights of every man, every woman, every child is in itself a political act. He defended freedom fighters and the leaders of the struggle because he believed in justice. George Bizos was a man guided foremost by his conscience, by his principles, by his ethics. We all know of his presence in some of the most famous trials in our history, and we have heard about some of them from Alexi. We've also heard about some of them from former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgamu Seneke. Being on the defense team at the Rivonia trial was a baptism of fire for George. He was still a young lawyer, but he made his mark with his legal prowess, and let it be said, with his street smart as well. It is recorded that he forewarned the trialists that the government was planning to hand down the death penalty on all of them. As the story goes, and as it is well known, he proposed that Madiba, who had written the speech that we all know now, that Madiba should add words, if needs be, into the statement from the dock, averting that would, for all intents and purposes, be an premeditated miscarriage of justice. Over the course of his life, George defended many leaders of the struggle, like Trevor Huddleston, as we had, Govan Mbeki, Walter Sisulu, and many others. But they were not just his clients. They trusted him and also became his friends. We all know of the role he played in the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was trusted by the families of Ahmed Timol, Steve Biko, Neil Argett, the Craddock Five, the victims of apartheid death squads. They trusted him to represent them. He did so faithfully, opposing the amnesty applications of the killers of Chris Hani, Ruth First, Jeanette and Katrine Skroon, and many others. Those of us who attended the hearings, and even those who were watching around the world, remain in awe of George's tenacity, as well as a razor-sharp questioning that reduced the once bold apologists of apartheid crimes to bumbling, fumbling at the witness stand. But there was also the George Bizos, away from the glare of the television cameras of the world. As our journey to democracy beckoned, Madiba asked him and Arthur Chaskelson to be part of the ANC's Legal and Constitutional Committee, working alongside a number of other ANC leaders. George and Arthur politely but pointedly asked whether they were required to join the ANC. Madiba said, "That is definitely not a requirement." It was not so much of a relief from Arthur and George, but they had expected that Madiba would not require that they would join the ANC. The committee fashioned the constitutional principles that are today the foundation stones of our Constitution. And then there was George Bizos, who led the team for the Constitutional Assembly to certify the first constitution of democratic South Africa, and who also assisted its drafting. George Bizos brought a unique quality of personality and intellect to bear on his knowledge of the law and the constitution of our country. His contribution has simply been quite extraordinary, and his influence on our constitutional democracy is without any doubt felt not only by those in the legal profession, but by many South Africans. Then there was George Bizos, the philanthropist, who was a founding member, as we have already heard, of the Saheti School, and who established a scholarship and bursary fund for needy students. There was George, always known fondly and simply as George to the young lawyers he mentored, who was a founding member of the Lawyers for Human Rights and the Legal Resources Center. There was George, always prepared to share the fruit of his vegetable garden, regaling young lawyers with stories of cases past, to the history of the olive tree or the symbols of ancient Greek history. And if there was a person who could regale anyone with stories, it was George. The man was a great talker. The ultimate purpose of the law is the guarantee of justice it promises, and George remained faithful to the notion that the law must serve the public interest above all. During his life, he mentored many lawyers, and today we've just had a confession from former Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke. Many of them are prominent in their own right and now are on the bench and in many other places. Much of that learning happened outside the courtroom and away from the chambers, in hours spent driving with him to court over a warm, leisurely, and enlightening lunch. It seemed at times his energy was limitless. Neither the onward march of age nor frailty could hold George from the courtroom, nor from his office. He was a legendary wit of equally legendary put-downs delivered with devastating effect to opponents during trials. He always spoke his mind and was never differential. He didn't care for the airs and the graces of politicians, and it is said that even President Mandela once got a good telling off from George. He wore his immense stature in our society with humility and dignity. His one-upmanship was reserved for the courtroom, never for young lawyers, clients, or even other senior counsel lined up at his door seeking help or advice. He treated everyone as his equal and with respect, from silks to judges, to the unemployed young man who had been illegally evicted, from ministers and presidents to the elderly woman who did not receive her grant. He was on the right side of history. When the democratic government fell short of its obligations, or when big business abused its power, he and his colleagues acted on behalf of the vulnerable. For him, the struggle did not end with democracy, but would only end when every man, every woman, and every child in our country enjoys the rights promised to them in the Constitution. We do owe it to his legacy to finish the business that George started. The injustices that happened under the death squads, detentions under apartheid, must still all be laid bare, and the dignity of those who still do not know what happened to their loved ones still needs to be restored. The law must continue to be an instrument of protection for the most vulnerable of our citizens, be it against individuals, businesses, or the state. The same spirit that drove young men like George to enter the legal profession should serve to inspire other young lawyers today to enter the field of human rights law. George has finished his odyssey. He has run his race. The legal profession and the country is poorer for this great loss. Indeed, a great baobab tree has fallen. On behalf of the people of South Africa, I offer my deepest condolences to the Bizos family, and I do thank them for giving us this great giant and for being prepared to share him with us as a nation. It was said by our former rulers that George Bizos was not fit for purpose, or fit and proper. If having conscience, principle, and commitment, and standing up for what is right, no matter the cost is, not fit and proper, may we all be granted the courage to be regarded as neither fit nor proper. It was Archimedes of Syracuse who said, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." George was indeed a son of the soil, not born of it, but he was the soil itself. He will forever be remembered, and we will remember him in his robes, rising to address the court and smiling, leaning on his cane as he whispered to his clients and his protégés. From where he stood, in his own unique way, he did move the earth. He was a patriot, he was a hero, and he became a citizen of South Africa, and a proud one for that matter. He was the embodiment of a fit and proper South African citizen. It was an honor and a privilege to have known the man who lies here. George, your friend of 65 years, Madiba, is waiting to welcome you. Your other good friend, Arthur Chaskelson, is waiting to discuss the legal cases that you both got involved in, and some of those that you argued before him as Chief Justice. I say, fare thee well, good friend. I thank you.